The coastal city of Porto, Portugal, was known for its cobblestone streets, scenic Douro River, and centuries-old architecture. But in the autumn of 2023, the city became infamous for something far darker. It began subtly, children waking in the night, screaming of shadows in their rooms. Parents dismissed the nightmares until they noticed the bruises, strange, circular marks on their arms and legs. Over the course of weeks, the phenomenon spread to families across the city. Children spoke of a tall, faceless man with long arms who whispered promises and threats alike. When the first child disappeared, a boy named Tomas, last seen playing in his backyard, panic rippled through the community. Within a month, 25 families reported missing children, with no clues except scattered drawings of a slender figure with blank eyes, etched by trembling hands. I arrived in Porto at the request of a desperate city official, my reputation as a paranormal investigator preceding me. The locals whispered a name I hadn't heard in years, Slender Man. I began my investigation at the home of Tomas's family. His parents were pale with exhaustion, their eyes hollow from sleepless nights. They led me to his room, untouched since his disappearance. The walls were covered in crude crayon drawings of the same figure, tall, thin, and featureless. He said the man promised to take him to a better place, his mother said, clutching a rosary. He'd been hearing voices for weeks. A chill ran down my spine as I studied the drawings. The details were too consistent, too vivid to dismiss as childhood imagination. In one picture, the slender figure stood beneath a tree, surrounded by writhing shadows. "Did you hear anything that night?" I asked. His father hesitated. "Not at first. But when we went to his room, the window was wide open. And there were marks. They showed me the tree outside their home, its bark scarred with scratches too precise to be natural. The same marks appeared in other cases. Families described how the faceless man had visited their children in dreams before they vanished. His arrival was always preceded by cold drafts, faint whispers, and the smell of damp earth. I spoke to Sophia, an 8-year-old who had survived an encounter. Her parents found her wandering the park near their home, shivering and unable to speak. When I showed her a sketch of the figure, her eyes widened in terror. "He said I had to play with him," she whispered. "If I didn't, he would take my brother." I checked her arms and legs and found the same circular bruises. "Did he say where he wanted to take you?" Sophia pointed toward the horizon. "To the woods." The woods Sophia mentioned were just outside Porto, a sprawling area of dense pine and eucalyptus trees known as the Mata Escura, or dark forest. Local legends told of spirits and cursed grounds, but I hadn't expected to find a connection to the disappearances. I ventured into the forest at dusk, the setting sun casting long shadows across the ground. Strange markings adorned the trees, elongated handprints and stick figures carved into the bark. Then, I found something chilling, a clearing where 25 piles of rocks had been arranged in a perfect circle. At the center was a tree taller and blacker than the rest, its bark etched with countless spirals. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, broken only by faint whispers I couldn't trace. That night, I reviewed the case files of the missing children. Their ages ranged from 5 to 12, and all had similar patterns in their behavior before disappearing: nightmares, drawings of the faceless figure, and an obsession with playing hide-and-seek. One file stood out, a boy named Luis, who had returned after being missing for 3 days. He was unresponsive, his eyes glazed, and his body covered in scratches. When I visited his home, his mother hesitated to let me speak with him. "He hasn't been the same," she admitted. "He doesn't eat, doesn't sleep. And sometimes, he talks to someone who isn't there." In his room, I found more drawings of the faceless man, but one in particular caught my attention. It showed Luis standing at the base of the black tree, surrounded by ghostly figures of children. Determined to uncover the truth, I returned to the dark forest with Luis's drawing as my guide. The whispers began almost immediately, faint at first but growing louder as I approached the black tree. A chill swept through the clearing, and I felt a presence behind me. Turning, I saw him, the Slender Man. He stood impossibly tall, his limbs unnaturally long, his faceless head tilting slightly as if observing me. I raised my flashlight, but its beam flickered and died. The air grew heavy, and the whispers turned into an overwhelming cacophony. "Leave," a voice hissed in my mind, though his featureless face didn't move. I staggered back, clutching a protective talisman. As I whispered an incantation, the figure melted into the shadows, leaving only the oppressive silence. Shaken but alive, I returned to Porto to consult with a local folklorist. Professor Duarte had studied urban legends for decades and had encountered stories of Slender Man before. "He's not just a legend," Duarte explained. "He's an idea, a thought form. The more people believe in him, the stronger he becomes." "What does he want with the children?" I asked. Duarte hesitated. "He doesn't take them randomly. He chooses the ones who are most vulnerable, most afraid. It's like a game to him. If the children can survive the game, they return. If not, he didn't need to finish." I revisited the black tree at dawn, armed with salt, iron, and ancient wards meant to repel malevolent spirits. The clearing felt different in the daylight, less threatening but no less unnatural. At the base of the tree, I found more drawings, etched with a child's hand, spirals, stick figures, and a crude depiction of the Slender Man. Beneath one of the roots, partially buried, was a small wooden box. Inside was a single shoe and a photograph of a boy I recognized from the case files. His name was Paulo, and he'd been missing for 2 weeks. The Slender Man wasn't just taking children, he was collecting pieces of them. The next night, I heard them, the voices of the missing children, faint and distant. They called out from the forest, their cries mingling with laughter. "They're close," Sophia whispered when I told her. "But they're lost. He keeps them hidden until they play his game." "What game?" I asked. She looked at me with wide, fearful eyes. "Hide and seek." The children's game of hide and seek wasn't just a pastime, it was the key to the Slender Man's influence. From the accounts of surviving children like Sophia and Luis, it became clear that the Slender Man played by a strict set of rules. "You hide," Sophia had whispered, trembling. "And he finds you. If you look at him too long, you're stuck forever. If you run too far, he takes someone else instead." I pieced it together, the game was a trap, designed to feed on fear. The children didn't stand a chance, not without help. But how did they play? Where did they hide? Luis's drawing offered a clue, the black tree at the heart of the dark forest. That tree wasn't just his lair, it was the starting point. I returned to the clearing at midnight, braving the oppressive whispers and the weight of unseen eyes. The black tree loomed tall and foreboding, its gnarled branches seeming to reach toward me like skeletal fingers. The air was charged, alive with energy. Then, faintly, I heard it, the laughter of children, echoing through the forest. It was disjointed, fractured, as though coming from another world. "Where are you hiding?" a child's voice called, distant yet close. I turned toward the sound but saw nothing. The laughter shifted to cries, then screams. My flashlight flickered, revealing faint shapes in the darkness, small figures darting between the trees, just out of reach. I called out into the darkness. "What do you want?" The whispers stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. Then, the Slender Man appeared. He emerged from the shadows, taller and more menacing than I remembered, his faceless head tilting in mock curiosity. "You play," a voice hissed in my mind, sharp and unnatural. The rules of the game were unspoken but understood. I had to survive his hunt. If I won, I might find the missing children. If I lost, I wouldn't leave the forest alive. I whispered a prayer, tightened my grip on the talismans around my neck, and began to run. The forest shifted as I moved. Trees twisted unnaturally, paths looped back on themselves, and the ground seemed to tilt beneath my feet. The Slender Man's presence was everywhere, his tall form flickering in the periphery of my vision, always closer than it seemed. I hid behind a fallen log, my breath ragged, clutching a handful of salt. Time stretched unnaturally, each second feeling like an eternity. Then, a low hum filled the air, a sound that vibrated in my bones. I peeked over the log. He stood there, still and silent, his head tilting as if listening. I fought the urge to look directly at him, knowing the longer I stared, the weaker I would become. The children's voices returned, louder now, overlapping in a chaotic symphony. They weren't just cries for help, they were warnings. "Don't run," one voice screamed. "Close your eyes," another shouted. I followed their guidance, moving slowly, keeping my head down. The Slender Man's shadow passed over me, and the air grew colder. Then he vanished, the forest falling silent again. I stumbled into another clearing, smaller than the first. At its center was a circle of rocks, and in the middle lay a child's shoe, eerily clean. Around the circle, the ground was scorched as though burned. Touching the shoe triggered something, a vision. I saw flashes of the children, huddled in the dark beneath the black tree, their faces pale and their eyes hollow. The Slender Man loomed over them, his long arms stretching impossibly wide. One of the children, a girl with blonde hair, turned toward me, her expression desperate. "You have to find the gate," she said, her voice echoing in my mind. The vision faded, leaving me disoriented. The gate, whatever it was, seemed to be the key. The next day, I visited Professor Duarte again. He listened intently as I described the vision. "The gate," he said, "could be a portal, a tether between this world and whatever dimension Slender Man calls home." "How do I find it?" I asked. Duarte handed me an old manuscript filled with sketches and symbols. "It won't be easy, but it's likely near the black tree. You'll need to perform a ritual to open it." The ritual required fire, salt, and an item tied to the missing children. I chose the shoe, the only tangible connection I had to their world. That night, I returned to the forest, the items for the ritual in hand. The black tree loomed as I placed the shoe at its base and poured a circle of salt around it. As I lit the fire, the air grew heavy, and the ground began to tremble. The flames flickered unnaturally, turning blue and green, casting eerie shadows that danced across the trees. A low groan echoed through the forest as a fissure appeared in the tree's trunk, black and pulsating like a heartbeat. The gate had opened. The gate wasn't just a portal, it was a doorway to another realm. Steeling myself, I stepped through. The world beyond was a twisted version of the forest, its trees skeletal and its sky an endless, swirling void. The ground felt unstable, like walking on shifting sand. The missing children were here, scattered and lost. They wandered aimlessly, their eyes glazed and their movements mechanical. When I called to them, they turned, their faces filled with recognition and fear. "He's here," one of them whispered. The Slender Man appeared, his form even more monstrous in this realm. His limbs stretched impossibly far, and his faceless head seemed to glow faintly. The children huddled together, their small forms trembling. "You must play," he said, his voice echoing in my mind. "One last game." I knew I couldn't win by his rules, so I made my own. Drawing a circle of salt around the children, I stood between them and the Slender Man, raising the talismans Duarte had given me. "Come for me instead," I challenged. The Slender Man tilted his faceless head, considering my challenge. His long arms swayed like pendulums, casting jagged shadows across the strange, barren ground. "You offer yourself in place of the children," his voice whispered directly into my mind. The children behind me whimpered, their small hands clutching at each other. Their pale faces reflected a flicker of hope, but also fear. They had seen what this entity could do. "Yes," I said firmly, gripping the talismans in my trembling hands. "Take me and release them." The Slender Man moved closer, his elongated limbs dragging behind him like roots torn from the earth. "Your life is a candle, flickering and brief," he hissed. "What I take from you is more than flesh, it is memory, meaning, existence itself. Will you give it willingly?" The children huddled tighter as I nodded. But as the Slender Man reached for me, I acted. Instead of stepping into his grasp, I threw a handful of salt directly at his featureless face. The effect was immediate. He recoiled, his long arms snapping like whips as an unearthly screech tore through the air. The talismans in my hands glowed faintly, their protective energy holding the entity at bay. Using the moment of reprieve, I began the ritual Duarte had outlined in the manuscript. I carved symbols of banishment into the ground around the children, chanting an incantation that drew on ancient protections against thought forms like Slender Man. "You defy the game," he growled, his voice shaking the twisted realm. "This isn't a game anymore," I replied. "You've broken your own rules by taking what isn't yours." As I completed the incantation, the strange realm began to tremble. Cracks appeared in the sky, revealing glimpses of the forest beyond. The children gasped as their translucent forms started to solidify, their ties to the Slender Man's dimension weakening. The Slender Man lashed out, his long arms smashing against the salt circle protecting the children. Sparks flew as the barrier held, but each strike weakened it. "You cannot win," he hissed, his faceless visage looming above me. "You are nothing in this place." But I had one final move. I grabbed the child's shoe from the altar, holding it high. "This is their anchor to your world. Without it, they are free." The Slender Man surged forward, his movements erratic and furious. His arms stretched impossibly long, reaching for the shoe. I threw the shoe into the growing fissure in the sky, where the forest glimmered faintly. It disappeared into the light, and the rift began to widen. The ground beneath us shook violently, and the oppressive air of the dimension started to lift. The Slender Man screamed, a sound that was more inside my head than in my ears. He lunged toward me, but the talismans glowed brighter, forming a shield that deflected his attack. Behind me, the children began to vanish, their forms returning to the waking world. One by one, the children disappeared into the light of the fissure, their laughter and cries echoing faintly as they returned to safety. The Slender Man's form began to fracture, his limbs dissolving into shadows. "You have taken what is mine," he growled, his voice fractured and weaker now. "You never owned them," I spat back, holding my ground as the last child vanished through the rift. With a final, ear-splitting roar, the Slender Man collapsed into a writhing mass of shadows, which were drawn into the fissure. The light consumed him, and then everything went silent. I awoke on the forest floor beneath the black tree, the early morning sun filtering through the branches. Around me were the missing children, alive but unconscious, their breath steady. The villagers found us shortly after. Tears of relief flowed as families were reunited, and the children, though shaken, seemed unharmed. Professor Duarte arrived later, inspecting the talismans and the strange marks left behind on the black tree. "You've done it," he said quietly. "But this place will always carry his shadow." The black tree, now devoid of its ominous energy, stood as a reminder of the terror that had gripped Porto. The villagers vowed to protect the forest, ensuring that no child would ever wander too close again. As I prepared to leave, Sophia approached me, her small hand clutching a piece of paper. It was another drawing of the Slender Man, but this time, he wasn't alone. A stick figure stood beside him, holding a glowing talisman. "It's you," she said simply. I left Porto with a heavy heart, knowing the Slender Man might not be gone forever. He was an idea, a fear that could resurface anywhere, anytime. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I could still hear the faint echo of his whisper. "This isn't over."